Welcome to this podcast of the Grupo de Estudios Venezuela, Estados Unidos. My name is Dr. Micheal Tarver, and I'm a professor of history at Arkansas Tech University. This morning, we are pleased to have as our guest Marcus Golding, currently a doctoral candidate in Latin American history at the University of Texas at Austin. He has participated in several initiatives connected to the digital humanities and public history, including the Red Historia Venezuela, which he will discuss in a separate podcast. His doctoral dissertation, titled The Price of Doing Business, Foreign Capital and the Venezuelan Oil Industry, 1939 to 1976, explores the presence of U.S. oil firms in Venezuela and the close relationships they established with the local population. Today, Mr. Golding will discuss his dissertation research with us. So welcome, Mr. Golding.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tarver, for the opportunity of participating in this conversation with you today.
Thank you, and we are glad to have you in this project. In terms of your dissertation, we'll start with that. If you can you tell us how did foreign capital persist so long in the Venezuelan hydrocarbon industry while avoiding the economic nationalism that confronted it elsewhere in Latin America?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So yeah, essentially, what I argue in my dissertation, because my interest regarding this topic really came to me after, analyzing the long presence of foreign capital in the Venezuelan oil industry. When you compare that with other regions of Latin America or the Middle East, you find out that Venezuela had a long relationship with foreign capital before the country decided to nationalize it. So, I had this question of why that happened. And as I started doing my research, I realized that the key distinction was in the way these oil companies related with the Venezuelans in general, in terms of the kind of social investments that these companies made in the country, but also the way in which they integrated Venezuelans to all their activities in the country, and also how these foreigners sought to adapt themselves to the Venezuelan culture, the Spanish language, the traditions. And I think that's at the core that explains why this foreign interest endured for so long in the Venezuelan oil industry. Basically, I think that what sums up everything that I have said is the word social corporate responsibility, which these companies started to implement really at the end of the 1930s, early 1940s. And this notion entails that foreign oil companies perceive themselves as citizens of a community with responsibilities towards those communities. So these oil companies realized that if they didn't take into their own interests the social problems of the communities and the countries where they were operating, they could face threats to their long-term investments in the country. And that happened elsewhere in Latin America. The most glaring example is Mexico in 1938 with Lázaro Cárdenas, in which the oil companies, and several historians have studied that, among them Jonathan Brown, they showed that oil companies had a very intransigent position vis-a-vis the oil unions, and they were not able to compromise with the unions. So what happens next is that the unions became more radicalized, demanding the nationalization of the industry, and the Lázaro Cárdenas administration didn't have more options than proceeding that way. So these oil companies, or the subsidiaries of these oil companies in Venezuela, were very sensitive to what happened in Mexico, but also what happened in Venezuela in 1936 with one of the most important oil strikes against them. In December of 1936, they start to become sensitive to these examples of political and social turmoil in the oil industry. And in the particular case of Venezuela, they started to take action to shift the philosophy of the company from one not interested in social concerns to one focused on working with the communities, working with the Venezuelans, and trying to contribute to the general welfare and the national development of the country. So, in a nutshell, that's my response to why did these foreign oil companies endure so long in Venezuela. They behave differently.
Who, in your research, who do you think was sort of responsible for driving that difference in Venezuela, let's say, than in Mexico?
Yeah, so I argue that there are at least a couple of persons that were key in changing the orientation, the attitude of these foreign oil companies. And for our audience, when I talk about foreign oil companies, I'm mainly referring to Jersey Standard, or the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, Royal Dutch Shell, and Gulf, the Gulf Corporation. Each of them had subsidiary in Venezuela. In the case of Jersey Standard, we're talking about the Creole Petroleum Corporation. Shell had several ones, but the most prominent was Shell Venezuela. And then with Gulf, we had the Mene Grande Oil Company. And there were several others, but these were the biggest ones, the ones with more production in the country. And of the three, the Creole Petroleum Corporation was the most important one. So going back, and in my research, I'm focusing specifically in the Creole Petroleum Corporation, though I make connections to Royal Dutch Shell and other oil companies. So going back to your question, I think there are two persons that played a key role in this change of attitude, in this change of business philosophy. And those were first Nelson Rockefeller, who, he was an heir to the Jersey Standard family fortune. He was part of, he was Creole executive for a few years in the 1930s. And while he was in Venezuela, he witnessed the terrible conditions in which surrounding the oil camps. And not only, the people living close to the oil camps, but the workers working in the oil camps. And he realized that if change was not introduced, if companies didn't start, not only to provide good wages for the workers, but a long array of different public services to these workers, they could face similar situations to what was happening in Mexico and or in other parts of Latin America. So essentially, he introduced this idea of socially responsible corporation. And to the Venezuelan subsidiaries, it's interesting that the parent company, Jersey Standard, was already implementing many social welfare policies in the United States from the 1920s onwards. So this model started to permeate in Venezuela through figures like Nelson Rockefeller. And but then, in my view, because Nelson Rockefeller was there for a few years, then he moved to work with the United States government, and then he had his different other companies that he oversaw. So after he left, I think the main person driving the change in Venezuela was Arthur T. Proudfit. He was from California, and he worked in the Mexican oil industry before the nationalization. So he witnessed many of the intransigence of the American and British executives there, and he learned from that experience. And when he was moved to Venezuela, and he also was transferred to Argentina as well, which was also a very nationalist country in terms of oil resources. So he learned from these experiences, and when he moved to Venezuela, and eventually he became the president of the Creole Petroleum Corporation, he oversaw most of these changes at the local level. And it's also interesting to mention in my dissertation, I point what I believe is the exact moment in which this philosophy of corporate social responsibility is broadly adopted at the executive level of Creole Petroleum Corporation and the Jersey Standard. And it's during the negotiations regarding the 1943 hydrocarbon law. There's during that negotiation with President Medina Garita in Venezuela, those conversations started in a good way, but as they progressed, they stalled, and the Venezuelan government was concerned that the oil companies were stalling the conversation. They were not progressing in the way that the Venezuelan government wanted. So Medina Garita and his officials were issuing some warnings in the sense that if the oil companies didn't want to collaborate, he might take unilateral decisions regarding the oil legislation. And this warning was very important within Jersey Standard, because that led to the modification or the change of the team of the oil companies that were negotiating with the Venezuelans, and the removal of Henry Linham, which was the head of one of the subsidiaries of Jersey before it was called Creole Petroleum Corporation. It was a standard oil company of Venezuela. He was removed because he opposed to this legislation, and in its place, they brought Arthur T. Proudfoot, who, in collaboration with changes that happened also at the board of directors of Jersey Standard, bringing more, if you want, more liberal or progressive executives, they team up to resume negotiations that ended up in the successful negotiation of 1943, the hydrocarbon law that we all know. So yeah, I would point out to these two figures. Mainly there were others, but I think these two were driving the change in the philosophy of the company.
Thank you. Was there much of a change in the approach, or sort of the willingness to engage more perhaps in these social responsible ways from the early years? You're looking at roughly 1940s onward, starting in 39. But from that period to when Carlos Andrés Pérez nationalized petroleum, or did the policy sort of morph in that time into less and more responsible, or?
Yeah, there are changes. I think that from 1940s to the end of the 1950s is, if you want, the golden age of these corporate social responsibilities policies. And just to make a clarification, first, there were all the policies that these companies were implemented in the oil camps, which basically were like covered by the collective contracts that they negotiated with the unions. So many of the social services that the workers received came through legal contracts that they negotiated, and also hikes in wages also came that way. But then there's all the other social services and social responsibility activities that these oil companies undertook outside the oil industry. So, for example, these oil companies became involved in trying to boost the agricultural production of the country, not only through supporting small farmers, providing them with different seeds, providing them with trucks to put the crops there and brought them to the oil camps, but also in more formal capacities. In, for example, 1947, the Venezuelan Basic Economic Corporation was created. Basically, it was an association or a partnership between the Venezuelan state, Nelson Rockefeller, and the oil companies. Basically, this corporation, its main purpose was to industrialize Venezuelan agriculture. So it invested in cattle ranching, in different techniques to boost crops. Then it also focused on creating businesses focused on fisheries and on bringing fish to the national diet. Also, from this initiative is that you get like the modern idea of supermarkets and so on. So this was a new way, in a more direct way in which these companies try to contribute to other economic activities outside oil. There were other nonprofits that they also contributed with, the American International Association, that came in tandem with the Venezuelan Basic Economic Corporation, focused on several things, but also in providing like scholarships for Venezuelans to train and pursue an education in agricultural sciences. Also, this initiative was geared towards increasing the nutritional intake of the most vulnerable groups in Venezuela. So this was, a very interesting experiment that took place at the end of the 1940s and the 1950s. But for example, in the 1960s, which is a period that sees the start of disinvestment in the Venezuelan oil industry. So it's from the 1960s to the period of Carlos Andrés Perez, you're gonna notice a gradual trend of disinvestment in the Venezuelan oil industry as a consequence of the policies of the Betancourt government, specifically of Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, who, he came with a new oil policy called the Pentagon. And among those policies, he adopted the policy of no more concessions for foreign oil companies. So that meant that oil companies could only would have to be content with the concessions that they have at that moment that were going to expire in the 1980s. And that generated a lot of uncertainty in the oil industry because they didn't have a clear future whether they would continue in Venezuela after the concessions ended or not. So they started investing, for example, in exploration activities. They decreased increasingly, and the oil companies started to focus more on production, basically raising the production of oil. But they also there was also a shrinking of the workforce, and so this is a period of disinvestment. But even in that period, you have, for example, the Creole Petroleum Corporation, starting in that decade, which was a very tumultuous political decade in which the Betancourt administration faced several threats from the right and from the left. Looking at that political environment, political circumstances, we all believed that the business class, foreigners and nationals, had to confront this situation proactively if the free enterprise system was to, survive in Venezuela, because they feared that communism could triumph. And in the way that the company thought they could address this issue was through a widespread adoption of social corporate responsibility among the business class of Venezuela. They thought that if the businesses started to contribute to the social problems of the country, you could prevent that outcome. So, for example, in that regard, the Creole Petroleum Corporation came with the idea of hosting a conference with Venezuelan businessmen to not only talk about the need of adopting this new philosophy of social responsibility in the business community, but also seeking concrete ways to commit the Venezuelan business class to this goal. And in order to do so, the Creole Petroleum Corporation partnered with other important Venezuelan businessmen, among them Eugenio Mendoza Goiticoa, who was one of the leading Venezuelan businessmen at the time. He also was part of the philanthropic movement in Venezuela as early as the 1940s. He also shared this conviction of a socially responsible company with the Creole Petroleum Corporation. And together with other businessmen, they hosted conference in Maracay in 1963, where the conclusions of the conference was that the business class committed itself to this new philosophy of social corporate responsibility, and the concrete result was the creation of the voluntary dividend for the community in 1964, or dividendo voluntario para la comunidad, which was a pioneer in this kind of nonprofit organizations, because it was the first business association that channeled a percentage of the net profits of the affiliated members towards two broad areas: social community action and education. And social community action encompasses everything from trying to address the problems in slums in the cities, but also in rural areas. And education also encompasses every level. The funds were dedicated from building schools to improving learning experience of kids in elementary school, to provide universities with new labs and new workshops and so on. So this was the crowning achievement of Creole, I think, in its pursuit of this philosophy to spread this idea among the Venezuelan business community. And this happened in the 1960s, in a period in which the oil companies started to disinvest and reduce their contribution to this kind of social projects. So definitely there's gonna be a change. There was a change in the oil companies, in the oil industry, because as I mentioned earlier, the workforce was gradually reduced. The companies were investing less capital in the oil industry, but at the same time, outside the oil industry, their commitments started also to reduce, but they kept investing in social projects, even though they were not able to provide to commit themselves as much as before, but they were contributing to the voluntary dividend for the community. But these oil companies also had their own foundations, so they also committed resources to these foundations to carry out their own independent or individual projects. So even right to the end of the nationalization, the Creole Foundation, the Shell Foundation, they were active in the nonprofit movement, financing many projects.
Okay, thank you. You also, in sort of your research endeavors, have compiled a database, I believe, of Venezuelans who worked for the companies. Can you discuss that? I mean, what have you found? I know it's all still work in progress.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Dr. Tarver. Yeah, the idea of compiling this database was because in analyzing the attitude or behavior of these oil companies in Venezuela, and also reading about the same experiences in places in Latin America or the Middle East, I was struck by how committed these subsidiaries were to promote local talent within the oil industry, in comparison to, for example, the Middle East, where nationals were frequently blocked from progressing to management positions. So I decided to, as I was doing my research and reading, newspaper articles and corporate publications and so on, I started to take note of every section that said, I don't know, Pedro Perez was promoted to general or director of engineering in Creole Petroleum Corporation. So I took that information and I placed them in an Excel sheet, essentially. And I started to track all these promotions that I found in the sources. And I slowly start to build like a career path of many of these Venezuelans within the industry. And, so far I have been able to compile, I think, close to 90 or 100 individual Venezuelan executives that rose through the ranks of all these foreign oil corporations. I also decided to compile the trajectory of many labor leaders, approximately, I think, 30 or so. And additionally, in addition to that, I also have a section called Civil Society and Government, because many of these executives also had pursued their careers in civil society organizations or in the government. So I wanted to also see how they were related, or how the oil industry connected with these other sectors. So that's, overall what I have been able to compile. Some interesting things to mention here is that many Venezuelans received scholarships from the Venezuelan government in the 1930s, but then more commonly from the same oil companies they work for, as scholarships to go to the United States and pursue careers in engineer or management, etc. So, for example, the leading universities where they tend to go were Texas A&M, the University of Texas at Austin, Tulsa University, the University of Oklahoma, Berkeley, California, and the MIT, right? But there are other interesting things that, just to put in context, I think the numbers that I just mentioned with the concrete lives of some of these important Venezuelans that I believe had been ignored in general when talking about the Venezuelan oil industry. They don't feature prominently, and I think they should, because they speak of what these oil companies did and how they promoted this local talent that then are going to be the ones leading the Venezuelan state-owned oil company Petróleos de Venezuela when it's nationalized. So, for example, there are very interesting career trajectories, like the one of Guillermo Zuluaga, who was an engineer. He also worked at the government in the 1930s in the departments that that were in charge of overseeing the activities of the oil companies. But he then started to start working with the Creole Petroleum Corporation and he eventually became the first non-American chief geologist of that corporation. But more importantly, he became the first national to serve at the board of directors of any of these foreign oil companies in 1951. And after him, more will come. We have the case of Ciro Vázquez, who was also an engineer, but he slowly over the decades became a member of the board of directors of Creole, and then he became the first Latin American to sit at the board of directors of Jersey Standard in New York, and eventually he became vice president of Jersey Standard. People like Carlos Lander Marquez, who he was a lawyer, he was the head of industrial relations, and at Creole, he was the one negotiating the first collective contracts in 1945 and 1946 with the oil unions. He also became member of the board of directors of the Creole Petroleum Corporation, and he eventually, with the support of the Creole Foundation, he created IESA, el Instituto de Estudios Superiores Administrativos, this business school that exists to this day. It was an initiative that he led. And, I also have cases, for example, Humberto Peñalosa, who also worked for Creole, but then had a distinguished career at the Ministry of Hydrocarbons and Mines. And he became governor of Venezuela before the OPEC. And he also was the first one to found the first private Venezuelan petroleum company. Mito Juan was the name. And then you have guys like Luis Alcalá Sucre and Alberto Quiroz Corradi, who both became presidents of their subsidiaries. Luis Alcalá Sucre was the president of Mene Oil Grande of the Mene Oil Grande Company, and Alberto Quiroz Corradi, the president of Shell, right before the nationalization. And, there are other cases. The case of Gustavo Coronel, who, I'm thankful for, because I had the chance to speak with him when I was doing my research, and he provided me with many important details about the lives of many of these Venezuelan executives. He was a Shell, he got a Shell scholarship in 1952. He then specialized in engineering, geology. He rose to management positions at Shell. Then he was transferred to Indonesia to try to prevent the regime of Sukarno from taking over Shell assets in Indonesia between 1965 and 1966, I believe. He also founded an important organization called the Asociación de Agrupación Petrolera, or Agropet, who played a crucial role in the nationalization debates of 1974 by pushing for a more technocratic nationalization and a less politicized nationalization. And that's what Carlos Andrés Pérez ended up doing. And, these are just some examples. Just to go back to the numbers, you can see the Venezolanization of the board of directors of many of these companies. In the case of Priol, the one that I am studying, by 1946, there were no Venezuelans on the board of directors. But by 1956, you had 2 Venezuelans out of 8 board members. So 6 were Americans, 2 were Venezuelans. By 1966, you have 4 Venezuelans, 6 Americans. And then by 1971, you have 5 Venezuelans and 3 Americans. So you have a progressive Venezolanization of the leadership of these oil companies. And in the oil industry, for example, by 1972, you only had like 40 workers, oil workers that were foreign. The rest were Venezuelans. And we're talking, back then, the workforce was around 10,000 workers. And to the employee level, only 8% were foreigners, approximately 893 foreigners, and the rest were Venezuelans. So yeah, these are some of the findings that I have been able to gather from this database, which, as you mentioned, is work in progress. I would like to, try to, clean it up, put it in a nice online place where people can see the trajectories of these Venezuelans in the Venezuelan oil industry. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to seeing the results of that work. So finally, then, is there anything else you would like to share with us in terms of your dissertation or the research or that topic before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I think finally, perhaps 3 things, really quick things regarding my dissertation and the ways I think it's significant. First, I think most works on oil in Venezuela tend to focus on the economic or technical aspect of the industry or the political aspect. Right? There has been a lot of research between, the position of the Venezuelan government versus and their connection with and their negotiations with the oil companies or their relationship with the United States government. But I think not much attention has been placed on the industry of itself, the names of the people that work there, how they integrated themselves into the Venezuelan society, how they connected their activities to other sectors of the Venezuelan society and economy. So I think my work seeks to contribute in that direction, and I follow the path that, for example, others have already established. Probably Rodolfo Quintero was the first one to focus on the cultural and social aspects of the presence of these oil corporations in Venezuela, followed by Fernando Coronil, Miguel Tinker Salas. And so I follow that tradition, but focusing more on the activities and the policies and the men and women that were in charge of um, of basically carrying out these social corporate responsibilities policies in Venezuela and interacting and integrating themselves with the Venezuelan society. And then I think that, or I hope that, if I end up publishing this book, this manuscript, sorry, I think it has a usefulness beyond academia. I think that businesses could be a target that could be interested in reading the experience and the case of the Venezuelan oil companies in the 20th century, and how they were able to, identify not only with the goals of economic modernization of the country, but also implement social policies that contributed to that goal, and in that way effectively reduce the virulence, I would say, or moderate the kind of economic nationalism that took place in Venezuela, that in other countries became more radical as these companies did not respond to the social and economic concerns of the host country where they were operating. So that would be everything.
Okay, thank you very much. And we are pleased that you have joined us in our project here to sort of promote Venezuela and particularly the United States and Venezuela to our market. So we appreciate it, and this will conclude our podcast again with Mr. Marcus Golding from the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tarver, for the opportunity.